Real people, real opinions, Real Talk Radio. The multi-award-winning Niall Boylan Show.
Ireland's classic hits.
Michael Shellenberger. He is an author, best-selling author of Apocalypse Never, San Francisco, and hero of the environment. And I spotted an article today online, and it was World on the Cusp of Woke Totalitarianism as Governments Act to End Freedom of Speech. And, of course, this is absolutely in vogue of what we were discussing last night with politicians on the air in relation to Ireland's hate speech laws. And he joins me on the line. Michael, good evening to you.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Michael, your article was very interesting, and I'm just going to point out one bit of it here. The idea that governments around the world have for years been secretly censoring ordinary citizens sounds crazy, but it's true, according to you. Worse, they are now on the cusp of imposing what can only be described as totalitarian system to end freedom of speech as we know it. Have you seen Ireland's hate speech laws that are proposed and were voted for by politicians only the other day in the Oireachtas here in Ireland? Have you seen them?
Well, I have, and we just wrote about it. And I should say I'm a lifelong liberal person. I never voted for Trump. I voted for Hillary Clinton, and I voted for Biden and Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. But what is happening in Ireland, in the European Union, in Britain, the United States, Brazil, Australia, Canada, New Zealand is terrifying. Everybody should know about it. It's so terrifying that people pushing these bills have been doing it secretly. Your guest just said she hadn't read the legislation.
And she's running for election, by the way, in the next general election.
Yes. So this is absolutely insane. Now, what's happening in Ireland is actually one of the most extreme pieces of legislation. It would criminalize possession of content deemed to be hateful. Well, let me tell you something. There's a debate in the United States right now about whether biological males who call themselves trans women should be allowed to play rugby or do boxing with biological females. Okay, there's people that have positions on both sides.
That debate is happening in Europe too. It's happening everywhere. Yep, I understand.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, so if one side says, as one side is doing, that arguing that trans women should not be allowed to compete in women's sports, if one side says that that's hateful, then what is the government going to do? It's going to settle that debate. It's going to say there is no debate. That's the end of democracy. That's totalitarianism. And you have to remember, fascism and communism were geographically limited. If the EU gets its way, a tiny number of bureaucrats and a tiny number of privately controlled NGOs, non-governmental organizations, will decide for the entire Western world, because they will exercise influence over how Facebook and Twitter censor information. They will control our information. This is absolutely insane. Now, the United States has the most strong free speech rules of any Western society. We do not have a speech regulator. We do not think it's consistent with our values as freedom-loving people to allow anybody to tell us what we can and can't say.
The argument is, Michael,
very limited.
The argument when I speak to politicians this week, and in our Oireachtas, which is similar to your Senate, it was voted on the other night, and it was carried forward, 110 votes to 14 against. So 110 politicians who towed their party lines, basically they couldn't vote against it or they'd lose the whip, but they voted again for this piece of legislation. And their argument is because of the world we live in at the moment, that, you know, and there is no doubt there is a lot of hatred on the internet. There is absolutely no doubt about that. No one can deny that. And some people go too far when it comes to debate, that they need to control and regulate the things that are said. Like, for example, I'll give you one example. I had a woman on last night who had a trans daughter, or a trans son, should I say. And her son is 21 years of age. And she said that he feels, because he sees online all the time, and she says online, trans people are pedos, trans people are groomers, or some people who go over the top with their explanations and their debate, that it's unfair on him and he can't go out because he's embarrassed and he feels like what he's been told he feels like. So they say, you know, we have to regulate it. What do you say to that argument?
I say, first of all, the first thing you have to understand is that tolerance for minority groups, whether racial or sexual, has never been higher in Western societies. The percentage of, I don't know the number for Ireland, but in the United States, the percentage of Americans who say black and white people should be allowed to marry has risen from 5% in the 1950s to over 95% today. This is the freest, most tolerant societies that have ever existed. Trans people have gone from being stigmatized to celebrated. In Western societies, no minority group has ever gone from being stigmatized to celebrated so quickly as trans people. So are there people out there who say mean things? Absolutely. Should the government decide what is mean and what's not mean and censor it on the internet? Absolutely not. That is anathema to the founders of the Scottish Enlightenment, of the English-speaking world's Enlightenment, of the United States, of Ireland. I mean, I don't think anybody in the world wants the government to decide what they can and can't say, or much less what they can or cannot believe in the privacy of their own homes. That's how far the Irish legislation goes.
Well, a lot of people are suggesting Leon Trotsky would be proud of this legislation. I'm looking at one of the lines in the legislation, and subsection 1, by the way, is the legislation itself, which is incite to violence or hatred against any particular group or characteristics, right? And they do actually highlight gender in one of those, okay? But it says, in any of the proceedings for an offence under this section where it is proved that the accused person was in possession of material such as referred to in subsection 1, and it is reasonable to assume that the material was not intended for personal use of the person shall be presumed until the contrary is proved to have been in possession of the material. In other words, you're guilty unless you can prove you're innocent. And this is the first time a piece of legislation has actually put that subsection in. In other words, it's not up. It's like the revenue commissioners or the tax man. It's not up to them to prove you earned the money. It's up to you to prove that you didn't earn the money. It's more or less exactly the same situation. It's up to you to prove that you weren't, say, for example, somebody had sent you a WhatsApp message with somebody that had incitement to hatred in it or incitement to violence in it. It's up to you to prove that you don't possess it anymore, not up to them to prove you have it, which is bizarre.
It's shocking. I can't believe we're having this conversation in 2023. This is the kind of thing you would read about in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union or under the Nazis. This is absolutely crazy. Every single person that voted for that in the Irish government should be ashamed of themselves. They should demand, the people of Ireland should demand that they retake a new vote. Clearly, I will give everybody the benefit of the doubt and assume that they did not read the legislation, because I have a hard time believing that the good people of Ireland have elected representatives that wanted to impose totalitarianism of the most insidious and corrupt nature on their fellow citizens. I find that hard to believe.
I've heard the name George Orwell has been thrown around quite a lot this week, actually. In relation to this particular piece of legislation, it's very similar, I imagine, to what is going to be proposed across Europe. I don't think they'd get away with this in the United States, of course, because of the First Amendment and the freedom of speech. We don't have freedom of speech in our Constitution. We have freedom of expression, which is slightly different. So we don't have those same privileges that you have in the United States. But still, many people believe this is an attack. But you yourself, on your Twitter account, you're talking to people about how to fight against it. So how do you fight against this? When you are in a situation where we have elected representatives who are pushing legislation like this through because, of course, they're listening to funded NGOs constantly all the time, how do you stop it, or how do people make a stand?
Well, this is a very important question, and I want your listeners to know they can contact me directly, and my name is Michael Shellenberger, and they can find me on Twitter. They can send me a direct message. It's open to anybody. I think this is so important. I'm traveling to London next month, the middle of next month, for a major public event to raise the alarm about this. It's very simple. You simply have to expose what's going on. You have to write about it. You have to post about it on social media. You have to demand that your legislators stop this. There is absolutely no role for any government in regulating the speech of their citizens. There's private media companies. They can do their own censorship, allow there to be competition between the newspapers and the social media. Keep the government away from our freedom of expression. I know we have slightly different constitutions, but we are all freedom-loving people. Our ancestors did not go to war to fight fascism, and they did not go to fight communism in order to have their great-grandchildren or grandchildren impose these restrictions on freedom of speech. This is what our ancestors fought and died to avoid. In the United States, our founders believed that freedom of speech was so fundamental they weren't going to approve the Constitution until there was a First Amendment protecting freedom of speech. They believed it was not given to them by a piece of paper, not by the Constitution. They believed freedom of speech was given to them by God or our Creator, whatever that was, that it came as an inalienable right. In the same way that you have a right to think your own thoughts, you have a right to express your own thoughts, you have a right to say what you believe, and it's nobody's business. The restrictions on freedom of speech are so narrow, you can't commit fraud. You can't say, hey, everybody, let's go kill that person, or let's go kill that group. That's direct incitement to violence. But other than that,
well, I just to
most
establish,
governments
we do have
much greater
laws.
protection.
Since 1989, we
Yeah.
already have incitement to violence and incitement to hatred laws,
Yeah.
which stop somebody saying
Exactly.
something exactly like what
Yes.
you said. But you also
Yeah,
mentioned
yeah.
it. You also mentioned as well in your piece that they're doing this under the guise of preventing harm. And I suppose that is the reason that they will play that card and say, well, look, Ireland is a much more diverse society. We have different sexual orientations. We have different genders. We have people from different communities around the world now living here. And we now have to protect all of these minorities or people with these characteristics. Is this the common excuse that we do this under the guise of preventing harm?
Well, it is that is the excuse that they use. This is remember, it used to be conservatives or the political right that demanded censorship in the name of national security. Demanding censorship in the name of avoiding harm is the same justification that communists use under communist rule. It is absolutely crazy. We have had racially and sexually diverse societies for decades. We've become more tolerant, more diversity of expression, free speech. If you want to increase intolerance, there's no faster way that you could do it than to have the government involved in censoring free speech and preventing people from having a conversation. That's how we got over our racism. That's how we got over our homophobia, was by having a free and open conversation. People changed their minds. You can't change your mind if you can't even express what's on your mind. So the entire fundamental principle here is absolutely totalitarian and even fascistic in its orientation towards speech. People must have the right to express themselves. They have the right to be wrong. They have the right to have different views, and it has to be defended by the public around the entire West, because we have had an Enlightenment-based system for over 200 years. It's been a long, hard fight to get here in the history of human evolution. We must defend it because people are going this is a gross abuse of power. It's coordinated. It's happening around the world. It's got to be stopped. It's going to take ordinary people standing up and fighting it.
You also, just very briefly before we finish, you talked about the Twitter files, of course, which exposed the FBI, exposed authorities in the United States, literally asking Twitter to remove people or censor people. Now, we haven't had Twitter files here in Europe, although Ireland is the European headquarters of Twitter. On numerous occasions, people have asked Elon Musk, who has now got involved in this debate. Of course, Elon Musk referenced Ireland during the week when he talked about Ireland's hate speech laws. You actually referenced Ireland in particular today as well when you talked about it. Do you think that Elon Musk should also then start looking at Twitter offices and Twitter establishments, and indeed maybe Mark Zuckerberg as well, Facebook, around the world to see what else was going on over the last 4 or 5 years?
Absolutely, and I have testified to that extent before the Congress on 2 occasions over the last 2 months. The solution to censorship and to all of these issues is transparency. That means not for transparency for a small number of so-called researchers who are then going to manipulate the data to control what the platforms do. The transparency should be viewed for everybody. So if Facebook or Twitter censor somebody for any reason, then they should be transparent about it. It's very simple. They just have to say, this person, we censored this, or we filtered it, or we put a warning on it. They just need a simple web page. It's not restricting speech. You're actually increasing speech. You're increasing debate and transparency and visibility. It should be mandated by governments. That's all that should be done. There should not be governments involved in restricting speech. If there's any involvement at all, it should just be to demand that the social media companies make transparent how they're making their decisions to censor content.
Well, look, it's been wonderful talking to you, Michael. And if you're ever in Ireland, you're welcome to drop into the studio here, maybe have a longer chat with us in relation to your work, because I've read quite a lot of your work at the moment, and it's excellent stuff. Michael Shellenberger, if you want to go onto
Thank
Twitter,
you so much.
you can find him there. And of course, there's information there, Michael. People can find information on to get advice on what they can do if they feel, this is not what they want in a society. And I think most people feel that way, to be honest with you. Michael, thank you very much indeed, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Real people, real opinions, Real Talk Radio. The multi-award winning Niall Boylan Show.